it all happens in a day. I'll walk into my shop in the city where all the sales stock is. Everybody will be flat. The heat's been up now. It used to be November, used to be before Christmas. Now it's January. Global warming is real, people. It's out there. We see it. I just had the mildest winter ever. The instruments didn't shrink to the degree that they had the previous 39 years that I've been doing this, you know?
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Well, welcome to another episode of Contrabass Conversations, your show covering life on the low end of the spectrum. I'm your host, Jason Heath, and I'm so glad to have you here. And visit our site at contrabassconversations.com to learn about everything that's been going on over the past decade with this show. And I'd love to hear from you. I love hearing people's stories, and I'd love it if you reached out and told me your story. The best way to do that is to email me at feedback@contrabassconversations.com. I know you're going to dig today's story with Bill Merchant. Well, Bill has been restoring and repairing double basses for nearly 40 years. He works out of his main shop in the Hudson Valley in New York, as well as in New York City. And he contributed most of the pictures, as well as design, editing, and text for Chuck Traeger's unique, important, seminal bass work, the setup and repair of the double bass for optimum sound. That's a must-have in the luthier world. And speaking of the luthier world, this is a deep dive. This is a geek out on all things luthier related for the bass, from rebarring basses, fingerboard dressing, to the effect of endpins on bass tone, bridge adjusters, optimal sound post adjustment, many more topics. Bill and I dig in. Bill's a great guy, full of knowledge and observations and thoughts about all sorts of minutiae related to the bass, and I know you're going to dig it. And for those luthiers out there listening, I know there are a lot of you. I know you'll have a fun time with this episode. I'm so thankful to have D'Addario Strings as our sponsor for Contrabass Conversations. And I want to let you know a little bit about their Zyx strings, which are synthetic strings. They have a synthetic core. They have a gut-like sound, growl and sustain. They play well under the bow. They're great for pizzicato. They're used by artists like Adam Booker, who we're going to have on the podcast in the next few weeks, as well as Barry Bales, Missy Raines, Mark Helias, many others. And D'Addario is doing a string giveaway for Contrabass Conversations listeners. So go to contrabassconversations.com/strings to get more information. I'd also like to thank Bass Capos for providing hosting for Contrabass Conversations. And Bass Capos are an excellent choice for any bass player looking to implement a double bass extension. They're easy to install and adjust, they're cheaper and more reliable than hand-built latches, and they're also lighter and quicker in operation. So learn more at basscapos.com, and thank you, Rob, for providing the hosting. All right, here we go with our conversation featuring Bill Merchant. Thanks for talking, man. This is going to be a lot of fun.
I'm good at that. Talking? Sure. Completely within my skill set there. What can I tell you?
That's great. I'm pretty sure we've met in person, but I know your name obviously from the bass world. And you're probably going to be I'm assuming you're going to be in Ithaca since that's so close. You're going to be at ISB?
I've got to make it. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I don't have the exact dates, but Ithaca is only 3 or 4 hours from here, or something like that, and totally within the realm. So I should make an appearance. The last one I went to was in L.A. God, in the 80s.
Okay. That's not so close. Yeah.
No, it's not. Well, it seemed like only yesterday, but there you have it. Right?
Yeah, that was decades ago.
A little longer than yesterday.
Well, I'll be there. So it's great. I'll get to meet you in person out there. I live in San Francisco myself, so I've got the super duper long trip out this summer for that, but should be a lot of fun.
I should probably get it on my calendar now, just to make sure I got it on my calendar. I work by myself, so it's harder to do these sorts of things since I downsized many moons ago to better serve the bass playing public and myself.
Right.
What do you know?
Well, because you work in, where is High Falls? High
Falls is in the Hudson Valley, between the towns of Kingston and New Paltz.
Oh,
on the thruway on the way to Woodstock.
Okay, that's beautiful. That's a It's amazing how I did a music festival up at Bard College many years ago.
Yep,
and it was
right over the river from me. Yep, about 20 minutes from here.
Man, that's such a beautiful,
25 minutes.
that's such a beautiful part of the country. That's great.
I get people from all over, from very nice places themselves who just love it when they come here.
Yeah.
My wife and I love it. I met her. I had already bought the house here, but she loves it just as much as I do. It's my adopted second home. I've been very active civically. I was their civic association treasurer for 6 years running. Boy, the stories you can get from being in a civic association. Boy, I'm writing a book someday. and I've been very involved with a local museum. I bought a house in '95 that was built in the 1820-ish because a canal came right through. And the remains are right in front of my house, and I became canal crazy. And so I'm president of the local canal society, and I spearheaded I was able to get $1 million grant from Open Space Institute in the New York State Department of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation. I have to do it that way. For them to purchase this historic property, it's taken a lot of my time. But so I've sort of gotten very involved in the community here, and it's really my adopted. I grew up about an hour north of here, in the Albany area.
Okay.
But I consider myself a New Yorker because when I was 19 or 20, I moved to Christopher Street and underwent severe culture shock, but also got to start working with Chuck Trager. David Gage was still studying and working for Chuck at the time. And thus began my career repairing double bass violins.
So was Chuck like the big shop in New York at that time? Was he like the guy that you go to get all bass work done?
New York to this day has probably more bass repair people than it should. He was pretty much the only one, but Colstein was still, in fact, Chuck used to go to Colstein before he went into the business.
Okay.
Colstein's was still very active, albeit out on Long Island. Mm-hmm. Paul Biazzi, who's now just, I hear, retiring, was Fantoni and Biazzi. For the 40 years I've been in the business, I never heard, Fantoni, where's he? And there was one other shop, the name will escape me, but that went out, where the guy retired, very quickly. Before the 80s even.
Okay.
But if you look at it today, you've got Jeff Bolback and you've got Colstein and you've got Earl Snitzer and you've got me and you've got, Biazzi finally, you've got, of course, Gages. It's a landscape with, dare I say it, too many bass luthiers by my lights, But I'm the oddball, I only go to the city 2 days a week. I've sort of, at a certain point, I enjoy the work too much. And I concentrate on that. And the best way I could do it was, first off, I needed more space, and I couldn't afford New York City. I mean, really,
right?
Right. And so here I am, 90 miles north, as close as I could afford to the city. I'm standing in my main shop, which is where all of my big projects come. So I still go to New York City 2 days a week, and have a shop on 29th Street. Mm-hmm. Where most of my sales stock, the consignment sales stock is, and where I do a decent amount of work. It varies with the economy. And my main shop is on, I purchased this property to have more room to do things like making my electric uprights and slowly making my first bass. I'm working on some acoustic bass guitar, and I've had for like 20 years. I'm dangerously close, hopefully by the end of the year, to have the first prototype up and ticking. I'm looking at the body here. There's the neck over there.
Wow, cool. So your first acoustic bass guitar. What got you into? Had that been gestating for a long time, or what got you?
It has. I mean, I've always worked on more than just basses. I was an electric bass player. I moved to New York City primarily to be a player, and I'm a much better electric bass player than I am an acoustic bass player, although I'm not horrible on the acoustic bass. But then I was lucky enough to get this job as an apprentice. I won't even say how little I was paid. But eventually, within 3 or 4 or 5 years, David Gage left the shop and opened up a shop in competition. Mm-hmm. I became Chuck's partner at that point until he retired. When did Chuck retire? I'd have to go look it up. But that sort of launched me on my way,
Okay. Wow.
So the acoustic bass guitar. So here I am as an electric bass player. I start doing electric bass and guitar work in the shop as well.
Yeah.
And somewhere in there, I kept seeing all these acoustic bass guitars, and they're either like the Earthwood bass, boomy. They've got a big enough body for low end, but you can't get any real point. Or most manufacturers take their biggest dreadnought and they put a different neck on it, and they call it a bass. So now you get the attack, but the bodies, none of them are very satisfactory. So when I moved up here, so in, 95, I had been, the idea had been in the back of my head, but I purchased some nice cello top wood from Metropolitan Music, enough for 3 instruments. And it just took me that long between all the things I was doing to slowly put it, because I had some ideas. It's an arch top. I actually used John Conte's Earthwood bass. A fairly well-known electric bass player in the New York area. I took a tracing of that because I figured this is as big a body as anybody wants to put on their lap,
Okay, yeah.
And so I've used that as the basis, and I've got an arch top. I'm looking at it right here. I had some ideas about bracing that I think are going to make it sound really good, and I'm kind of excited about trying to get it moving along. I've got a friend of mine that wants to help me once I get him into production. So it's a project I'm hoping I'll have more time to devote. My museum thing is taking up a lot of my time trying to get this $1 million project off. But I'm right now in a transition from doing everything for no money to doing the fun stuff for some money.
Okay.
So theoretically, that's going to free me up to get back to my bass business, which I'm afraid I've things like my personal projects I haven't had the time for.
Yeah. Well, that's how it goes. So you're starting to work on your first acoustic bass too? Is that what you said?
I am ashamed at how long I've been working on my first acoustic bass. We're not even going to say this. Gary Peacock, every time I speak to him, Gary wants to buy my first bass.
Okay.
I'm an idiot, Jason. I'm the stupidest man you've ever spoken to. So I'm looking at it. You know what really slows me down? And it's crazy. What we call hogging, which is moving massive amounts of material in spruce. So I've got the top, and I've done thousands of bass tops. I'm ready to make my own bass because I absolutely understand what makes a bass sound good, and how you need to make a top. And the sound is really largely in the top.
Okay.
And I'm really good at that. I take people, I put in new bass bars, regraduate, add wood where we need to. And so basically, I know exactly how I want my top to go. Get into it. So I've taken these too thick tops, or even where I add wood and take them down. But going from a giant slab of a top to where you get to do the fun work, it takes amazingly long. I'm sure I'm doing something wrong, and I need to rethink. I should talk to some of my colleagues and see what they're doing to work out the hogging aspect. On the acoustic bass guitars, I've got a buddy who Rob Angelotti in Germany, who I got a boy from Ohio who I met in New York, who's a machinist and a bassist. He makes these great capos for C extensions. And he and I, when we met back in August or September, I forget when we got together, he was very excited about helping me. So he may start on the acoustic bass guitars. He may start helping me get the tops to where I can then finish them. Because the slowest thing, and part of it too, is I do what I love. It's just not fun hogging, cutting bridges. I'll never sell you a bridge you don't need. I've just done 1,000 of them. I'm really good at it. But most jobs have something to keep you intellectually stimulated. Cutting bridges and hogging spruce doesn't. But I know it's a failing of mine that I have to come to grips with it. At this age of 59 years old. You can always learn.
That's great that Rob is. I actually got together with Rob. We were over in Prague at the Bass Festival and talked, and I actually did an interview with Rob. I haven't put it out yet, but great guy. That's cool that you guys...
No, Rob's great. I've known Rob for 20, 30 years. He's a sweetheart. His family's lovely. We had a great day with him. His 2 daughters and his lovely wife, Christine, I believe her name is. God, I hope I got that right. Those capos are great, and he's a good friend as well as a colleague and somebody that I'm looking forward to working with on this project. But once I get this prototype up and running, where I know what I really want, I'll send him a test top, and he'll probably start supplying tops rough cut to me, and he'll use modern technology for that, and then I can use hand technology for the most important. I make some furniture, and I do the same thing. You use power tools where they would have used apprentices 300 years ago.
Sure. And
then you do all the fine work by hand. And that's what I'm going to try and get to on this bass. And for that matter, the acoustic bass, I've got some thoughts on that when I can get some more time to devote to it.
Oh, cool. Well, that's great. You were talking about how the sounds all in the top or largely in the top. Like, what are you aiming for with your top? Like working on basses for so many years, and now you finally get to make your own first top. Like, what are some of the mistakes that you see and that keep it from sounding the best?
People make them too thin in the center.
Okay.
More often than not. And a lot of it's because they've studied old instruments. gut strings and steel strings, big difference. I'm fond of telling my clients that we live in the golden age of the bass because of steel strings. The bass needed a more, a less, I'm trying to think of the right word. Gut strings just change with the humidity and the temperature. And guys to this day, and I ask them all the time, we use gut, they're constantly having to retune,
Yeah.
So no matter how good you were, you could put your finger on the same spot on the fingerboard, you're going to get a different note at the beginning of the set, middle of the set, end of the set.
Right.
Unless you're constantly retuning. Yeah. Steel strings come in, and all of a sudden, boom, you can play in tune. It's no accident. In my lifetime, I've seen many, all of the tenured guys, they couldn't get rid of them quick enough. Once steel string players came of age and started playing, they can play rings around people that grew up by and large on gut. It's just a better technology. Having said that, I don't know if you're familiar with John Feeney. John is the principal bassist of St. Luke's. He blows my mind playing on all gut. He made me have to rethink this, and then I just decided, there's always an outlier like him that's way out, doing stuff that nobody else can do. I still stand by it. We live in the golden age of the bass because of steel strings.
Yeah.
But a lot of makers study, I won't name names because I'm just not going to be that catty, study the old basses. The old Italians, they'd make it 8 millimeters in the center of the top. I'm here to tell you, if you make your bass 8 millimeters in the center of the top and put steel strings on it, it'll always be wolfy because the sound post will be functionally too tight no matter how short you make it.
Oh, okay.
And everybody makes their sound post too tight. That's another... We can get to that topic.
Yeah.
It's simple, and I put it in Chuck's first book. I had a lot of input. Chuck Traeger's the repair and setup of the double bass for optimum sound.
Yeah.
I added a paragraph because to me it's really simple. You need to be 10 millimeters in the 9 or 10, and 10 is better in the center of the top, and no thinner than 5 millimeters in the edges.
Okay.
I was lucky enough to know Carleen Hutchins towards the end of her life, the seminal violin researcher, and I talked to her a lot about these sorts of things. I'm losing my train of thought here now. Older boy, that happens to you. But she studied violin acoustics, but her first cover article in Scientific American, she says you do these things after you do what traditional violin makers do. So what I'm looking for when I'm working on a top, those are my general, I actually make it even a little thicker at the sound post, which Ed Heron Allen, a talented amateur in England was awash with them in the 19th century, wrote a book on violin making. And though he never made a violin, but he hung out in one of the big shops, the name will come to me, like one of the biggest shops in London, the Hills. He hung out, so he studied the Hills. He actually makes it even thicker where the sound post sits.
Oh, okay.
So I actually make it 11 millimeters at the sound. Here I'm just giving why not? The knowledge is free. Execution still is difficult.
Right. Yeah.
So I'm shooting for 10 millimeters in the center, 5 in the edges, 11 where the sound post is sitting. But when I tap that top, I want it to sound all one note. And the theory about that is that now, in that one note, I believe that note is either the wolf note or related to it.
Okay.
If I get some time to just do some straight research, I can get to the bottom of that.
Yeah.
And so what happens is now, when you've got it all tuned to one note, it responds the same. If different spots and different thicknesses and tap tuned to a different note, then they're going to get more excited. You're going to get unevennesses in your frequency response. Whereas when you get it all one note, well, there's your wolf note. That's the note that the top gets excited, and it starts to vibrate in such a way that it interferes with making that note.
Okay.
But it's sympathetic vibration because now you're hitting the note that you've tuned to. And your bass bar needs to be, generally speaking, a half step higher than the top. It depends on how thick you make them. I think you should be making them 7/8 of an inch thick. I favor slightly sprung in bars. I know a lot of people don't, but properly done, a sprung in bar just makes the whole top a little more dynamic. It's going to be quicker to respond because there's a little tension built in. Oh, I've seen horrible cracks and problems from oversprung in bars. I don't know if you know what springing in the bar is.
No, what? Yeah, what is that?
Well, when you put in a bass bar, you've got what we call a free plate. You've got the top sitting on your bench, and you fit in the bass bar where it sits. But a sprung-in bar, you fit it such that the center touches, but you've got some distance on either edge, so that you have to push it, so that when you glue the bar in, it's got some spring. It's pushing against the bridge foot a little bit.
Okay.
But it's a dangerous thing. I've seen badly sprung bars. Boy, there was a bass in the Philharmonic that had a wicked crack. It was all about somebody who put in a bar so badly that it caused the crack. And I couldn't do anything. I had to remove the bar and rebar it properly, But, to me, it's really simple. And it's really magical too, because as you start getting that tuning in, everything starts, you touch it and the sound just jumps out at you. It's like one of the most exciting things I could do. I could sit and rebar basses and regraduate basses all day long. People, are you listening? Bring them on by. I'm the best value in New York City for this. It's amazing. And I find that I get an instrument that speaks really fast and nice and even in all registers, which is, I think, what all of us want, you know?
Right.
But also sound posts. Everybody fits them so tight that they actually impede the top's ability to reproduce the note. A sound post should be loose enough to fall when there's no string tension. I typically fit my sound posts with the D and G string off the bridge, the E and A sitting on the bridge, kind of taking the slop out of the box, if you will, putting a little pressure into it. And then that sound post should just slide right in. It shouldn't fall, but it also shouldn't push the top back up. If the top is too thin and you put the post in and you see it project upwards as you put the post in, I still shorten it.
Okay.
And this is what my clientele wants from me. They know when their post is too tight. And it's the single biggest thing that I see done wrong in every shop. They almost all fit them too tight. And I won't name names in that either because I'm just too nice a guy.
Why do people fit them so tightly? Is there a reason?
I have no idea.
Okay.
Having worked on this for 40 years, it's just been, I was watching a Discovery Channel thing about violin making. It must have been in Canada because it's a Canadian show. And they're putting up the sound post with no string pressure at all to fit. You know, the way all these musical instruments work is that you set the string in motion. The bridge then transfers that motion to the center of the top, and the center of the top moves in and out like a speaker cone and reproduces that wave.
Uh-huh.
Really simple to me because I've been doing it every day for 40 years.
Right.
When you get a sound post, I like to say to my clients, and these are things I say day in and day out, I'll go, so you probably have this much movement, and I go and hold my fingers apart less than 1/4 of an inch. When you put a post in as tight as most people do, you're forcing that top up, and you're not allowing it the full travel it might actually have built into it, and your bottom end is going to suffer. You're not going to get enough low end. And wolfiness, a wolfy A string is always a product of too tight a sound post.
Oh, okay.
And then the corollary, if you make your top 8 millimeters, all the old Italians used to do only 8 millimeters in the center, and so a lot of people want to emulate that. But the instruments changed since then. The strings are different. So if you're just going to use gut strings, I can keep the 8 millimeter in the center. But I guarantee you with steel strings, if you're only 8 millimeters in the center, it'll always be wolfy. It'll always play too tight. You will never get enough bottom end up.
Okay. Interesting. You were talking about tuning the top. How exactly do you tune the top? Well, actually, maybe a couple questions. What note are you aiming for? Is it A flat?
You know, I haven't codified it. It winds up being the note that when I get one section, usually the center of the top where I want it, I work out from there.
Okay.
The note doesn't actually matter as much, although again, I have to get to the bottom of this because my postulate about wolf notes. But basically, you tap on it, you hold it in a nodal point, a spot where it's not going to move, or you hang it on rubber bands. Chuck Trager in his book advocates that. And you tap it and you listen to it. And you know, it takes a while to develop the ear, but you'll hear you'll hear a lot of tones, but you'll hear a fundamental tone. And as you get the top tuned better, one note will predominate, and spots that are higher than that are too thick, spots that are lower than that are too thin.
Okay.
And so you take wood out or you add wood.
Okay.
And to some degrees, pre-existing tops don't give you never get perfect, but where is perfection anyways? You're always it's an ideal that I don't think anybody ever realizes it. But it's what you shoot for, you know?
Right.
So there'll be spots that'll be a little higher or lower, but you try and minimize that.
Okay.
And then you want, in my book, you spring in your bar slightly, and there's a very specific way that I do that. And I think that's a problem with a lot of people when they spring in bars, is that they don't think it through. And then you get, as I close in on getting the bass bar tuned in correctly and the top tuned in correctly, it just starts to speak. You touch it, your finger across it, and you hear it really loud. It amplifies it.
Yeah.
And to me, that's the magic of this work. I could do it. If that's all anybody did, it's why I have to get more into making. I got to get past that hump of, boy, when is this spruce going to get thin enough? God damn it. Gosh darn it, whatever. You know. But you know, it's also, you know, I work alone, so I've got, anytime somebody's got a repair, many of my clients, most of my clients are professionals who need their instruments quickly.
Yeah, right.
So you know, a repair comes in, that takes precedence over over my personal projects, if you will.
Sure. I used to live in Chicago for decades, and the change of the seasons and winter post, summer post, what is that? Do you typically have two posts for your clients? How does that work in a climate like New York? Okay.
In this climate, the distance between your back and top is about 1/8 of an inch less in the winter. In some place like Chicago or here in New York, in San Fran, you might not need two sound posts.
Right.
Because you're relative. It's all got to do with the humidity and relative humidity. So most heated rooms, if you don't humidify, can plummet to as low as 10% relative humidity because you've heated up the outside air. It's snowing outside. That's 100% humidity, people. But by the time because humidity is relative to temperature, remember your high school physics, gases, as you get them warmer, they get more excited, they move further apart, and there's room for something else in between them. It's water vapor most often. That's why dehumidifiers are really just air conditioners. They just cool the air, and it squeezes the water out. The molecules push the moisture out. I think that's also how rain forms to some degree. It's a similar process. So to make sure that post isn't too tight between the seasons, typically, now this last winter was so mild here in upstate New York, or in New York in general, that it wasn't anywhere near as dramatic as it usually is. It all has to do with the changeability of maple between changes in relative humidity.
Okay.
Maple is an amazingly strong wood. It has a unique interlocking grain structure that where it's strong cross grain. It doesn't split as easily as other woods, suffice it to say. But it also changes dimensionally in both dimensions. So many woods, when they get wetter, get fatter,
Yeah.
But maple gets both fatter and longer. This is why electric basses need to have their truss rods adjusted between summer and winter. The neck shrinks in the winter and expands in the summer. And so typically, my electric bass and my guitar friends, I'm adjusting their truss rods between the seasons for the exact same reasons. And it's the fact that mahogany also displays some of this characteristic, not to the degree of maple. But so you absolutely need two posts by my lights to get the optimum performance out of the instrument.
Okay, and you feel it when it's time, right? As a player,
So wood loses moisture quickly and gains it slowly. So everybody knows when they need their winter post because it all happens in a day. I'll walk into my shop in the city where all the sales stock is. Everybody will be flat. The heat's been up now. It used to be November, used to be before Christmas. Now it's January. Global warming is real, people. It's out there. We see it. I just had the mildest winter ever. I've never had a winter where the instruments didn't shrink to the degree that they had the previous 39 years that I've been doing this,
Yeah.
It's amazing. But it's that variability, it's sort of complicated geometry that causes, as the back and ribs shrink, that causes the top to get closer to the back. But the net result is that you should have a shorter post for the winter and a longer post for the summer.
Okay. Yeah, I was curious about when I would feel it. And I was wondering, because the January was when I was tending to do it in Chicago the last couple of years.
Well, and the other side of it is that they gain moisture slowly. So in the spring, I remember one year it was 80 degrees in March. I still didn't put in any summer posts until June because the wood gains moisture slowly. It's just never until June. So these days for me, it's winter post in January. It's summer post in June, right after Memorial Day. And people don't realize when they have too short a post in, the sins aren't anywhere near as apparent, although they still like the bass better when they get the right length. And also because it takes place over time, it's not as noticeable. Whereas in December or January, you come in one day and your bass has lost all its bottom end, the action just dropped, and you got this very wolfy A string that's fighting you with the bow, and it's quieter than all the other strings on the bass. It's winter post time. As the top gets bigger and bigger, it's happening gradually, and so you're not noticing any tonal changes because providing you're playing every day. Like you should practice. Bass players, you should practice. It's the most important thing.
Yeah, right.
About the 10,000 hour rule, that's all it takes to be good at anything, particularly studied at first in music. I love to tell beginners that. You just have to practice. That's all it is. If you want to be good, 3 hours a day for 10 years.
Yeah.
Roughly 10,000 hours. Also, the instrument always sounds better if you've been playing it, So if you're playing every day, you're not noticing as the top is expanding, or I shouldn't say that as the top is raising up, as the back and ribs are actually expanding. There's not much movement in the spruce on the top. It's all on the maple backs and sides.
That's so interesting. So you notice, because I've always heard the more you play a bass, the better it sounds. Do you notice that as a luthier? Can you tell?
Absolutely. Okay. And we think it. And I discussed this at great length with Carlene Hutchins, when she was alive. The feeling is that it's some sort of a playing in. It's the fibers reorient themselves, and the instrument gets used to moving a certain way, and it allows it more, basically, it gets a little more flexible. I mean, also, the first 30 years after you cut a piece of wood down, the parts of the wood that are taking on and giving off moisture become more crystalline. And so the wood becomes less likely to get waterlogged, and it becomes more resonant, and that's why this mania for old wood is out there. I think it's way overdone, but you do want nice dry wood. And if it's 30 years old, there's a chemical change in the wood that makes it more desirable. Much beyond that, a lot of it's just the violin business in general is so much about magic and so little about science. Colleen Hutchins was not really well respected by the violin world because she was applying hard science to something that, that doesn't do them any good.
Right.
We're selling magic.
Yeah.
It's a dirty, dirty business sometimes. That I can say. They're real. The violinists won't touch a bass. It needs too much work. You can't make enough money on it. It takes too much room in the shop.
Yeah.
There's this weird dichotomy. You'll get violin shops will work on everything up to the cello, and then the bass, they turn their noses up. They don't want to deal with it.
I've definitely noticed that. I remember going to some shops I won't name in Chicago when I was younger and more ignorant, and like, what? You won't look at my bass? What? So.
It was beneath them, wasn't it? Well,
it was, not right. Yeah. They looked at, it was like right. Exactly. Now, I don't own this book myself, but the Chuck Trager book, I've heard so much about over the years, and you were really involved in the making of that book, weren't you?
Yes, I was. I took many of the pictures. I was the photo editor. I was one of the final editors. I wrote a chapter on how to make a C extension without cutting on the scroll, because Chuck had never done that.
Uh-huh.
I added remarks regarding top thicknesses, just one paragraph that summed up what I just told you.
Yeah.
10 in the thickest, 5 in the thinnest, people. There you go. It's simple. And tap it in, And I just, along with my lovely wife, Kelly, who's a talented photographer, we created... She had the concept for the cover. It's the inside of a bass with the outside of a bass half and half.
Yeah.
And I took pictures. Whenever I get a nice bass in the shop, I document it. And I have a pretty hefty collection of name instrument pictures that someday might turn into a book as well. So I did all the cover design. And for his first 2 books, I did most of the final editing. He's got a 3rd book coming out now from Hal Leonard next spring. And we've been working with a professional editor, and there is a difference, I'm here to tell you. I learned so much. Farther and further. Never thought about it before. For instance, to give you one instance, but there was another really great. Chuck did a quote about knowledge, too much knowledge being a dangerous thing, and I never looked it up. Well, he misquoted it.
Oh, he
and
did?
The funny thing was, as my wife pointed out, it was kind of he did it from memory, and Chuck's going to be 91 in December. I had to laugh as I was going over the final edit with the changes. We had to okay all the changes that the editor made. I just had to laugh at that one. The irony was delicious. Was my comment to the editor. What do you know? But professional editors look that stuff up. I was Chuck's apprentice. If he said that's what it was, that's what he said. It never occurred to me to go to Roger's and, and just double check him, But, the pros, they know to do this. That would be very interesting that already the cover design is much more contemporary. I'm not a graphic artist, but like so many musicians, I've dabbled in it and I'm good in Photoshop. And so, I took the pictures and did all the photo editing for all of his books. And supplied the captions, done the reading. This first book, I made notes and notes and notes. I gave him more comments than anybody that he incorporated in the work, just things that struck me as I went along. His first book is a seminal work. I mean, there was nothing like that out there. You had the Weissler book on violins, but there's stuff that you do different on basses. Basses are, even though they're large violins, there are methodologies of work that are radically different between the 2 instruments. There's nothing like that out there. There's nothing on this. So, there's things that I do radically different than Chuck. Even though Chuck was my teacher, I've rethought, I believe at this point I've been working professionally as a luthier for probably 5 or 10 years more than Chuck did in his entire career. And so I'm constantly looking at things, changing things, figuring out ways to do things better, hopefully.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think to me that's a lifelong process,
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Are the differences, the main differences between, is it basically because of the size of the instrument that we have these differences? Are there acoustic?
No, I think pretty much, yeah. I mean, The one I remember the most is that when I take a top off, I always start at the C bouts. On violins, they do something completely opposite. you'd have more trouble in a bass. And it's got to do with the size more than anything else, I would think. Yeah. I mean, a lot of it is still similar. I think that the sound posts are fit routinely too tight on all the violin family instruments.
Okay.
It's just really entrenched.
Yeah.
And I know some luthiers get my posts and they think, oh, they're way too loose. Invariably, the customer comes back to me in a week or two. This just happened with David, the guy that had a wonderful shop, nothing wrong with him, but they replaced the post that I had in there with a tighter post, and it choked the sound. He didn't get enough bottom end, too tight. Okay. Wolfier, the classic.
Yeah.
But I bewildered that this hasn't caught on more. I mean, I shoot my mouth off all the time. My clients always hear me talk about, but I know I've got story upon story of people going to another shop and the guy, oh, this post is too short, and they go put a tighter post in, and boom,
So that Wolfier, that's like a classic signal that the post is too tight. You get that Wolfier?
Absolutely.
Yep. Okay.
And, I haven't checked it in the violin family, but I'm going to imagine that the G on a violin would be that there's a correlation across the board to that second lowest string.
Okay.
Too tight a post. But again, one of those things, nobody pays me for hard science.
Right.
I got a mortgage to pay. I'd love to have just fun, and I'm having a lot of fun, mind you, but still.
Yeah. Oh, well, I've got a friend out here in San Francisco, and we were talking a lot about tailpieces, and that's one of those things that I'd love to know your thoughts or what you've experimented with, because I mean the post, the bass bar, those. How they affect the sound, I think that's maybe a little more understandable to people. What do you do in terms of tailpiece or the length of string behind the bridge? Does that contribute very much to the sound?
It can hurt or help you, like so many things in the setup.
Okay.
So you pluck or bow the string, and for every action on the playing side of the string above the bridge, between the bridge and nut, there's an equal but opposite reaction on the tailpiece end. So when that's too stiff, the string doesn't move as much. If the string doesn't move as much, you have less sound, period, And the weight of it has an effect. So the heavier the tailpiece up to a point, the more it throws the string into a big vibration, the darker the sound's going to be, up to a point.
Okay. Because
mass is never your friend on an instrument. Too heavy an endpin kills the sound of the bass. I can't figure out why. I just know it's a fact. Heavy tailpiece up to a point is going to make your bass darker, and the lighter you get, the more you're going to lose fundamentally, get upper partials. And I've seen the massless, what I call the massless tail wires, where it's just all wire.
Yeah.
They come in and out of vogue. People come in, they love them for like the first 2 months, and they take them off. I don't know anybody that stayed with that. Now, having said this, maybe this gets out. Somebody will, of course, go, oh, wait, I have. But maybe they had a really, really dark bass that needed. And you know what? When the posts are too tight, that massless tailpiece is going to add more bottom end that you're losing because you're post. So nothing ever happens in a vacuum. Everything you do on the setup is going to affect the next thing down the line.
Okay.
So Chuck's latest book, he talks about a discovery that a Chicago area luthier by the name of Gary Rickman discovered that putting crazy glue on either end of the sound post really improved the sound. I can't replicate it, but I don't fit my post. I'm willing to believe that on a post that's tighter, that crazy glue does have an effect. But when I fit the post the way I fit them, I'm not hearing any effect.
Okay.
So he's really good at this. Guy gets paid, I think, $100 to go do this to your bass, and he's getting great results. And God love him, he's a talented man and a sweet guy to boot. But likewise, so the tailpiece and the length has a difference. You don't want the tailpiece too close to the bridge because, think about it, it won't swing as much. You don't want it too close to the saddle. So there's an optimum. I'm always looking for, Chuck had always taught us to tune to a fourth, octave and a fourth.
Okay.
So I want it to ring a D, but a C sharp is okay. And the other direction is all right, an E flat. But really, a D is what I'm shooting for. I want a tailpiece long enough to have, say, 1.5 inches to 2 inches of tail wire, and you don't want stiff stuff. You want some sort of flexible cable. It doesn't matter which one, whether it's a Kevlar cable or the 3/32 wire rope that I used for eons. As long as the thing can swing, that's the important thing. Okay. And then the weight, the lighter it is, the brighter that particular thing is going to make the instrument, and the heavier up to a point. If you get it too heavy, it's just going to kill the sound. It's going to be so heavy that it's just going to suck up all the energy.
Okay. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, and I know Gary Rickman he lives down the south side of Chicago. A couple friends of mine back from Chicago, he was like loves to experiment. That's interesting I'd heard about that crazy glue thing, but you found that the looser post sort of fixed that problem.
Yeah, to me, I think that the way I fit posts has it explains why I haven't replicated what I know. I trust Gary. He's a smart man, and I'm sure that's working really well for him. Again, it's one of those instances. Does somebody want to start supporting me to just do research? I'd love it.
Exactly.
But I got to pay my bill, so I'd love to experiment more with that because I think there's something interesting going on there. That now Chuck seems to think that it's making it a little more slippery.
Okay.
And again, when your post is tight, you notice more, so it's not impeding the top as much.
Yeah.
And I think there's some sense to that. And that's one theory that, I'm sure I could figure out an experiment to get to the bottom of that, Those
massless tailpieces. Yeah, it's so fascinating that you say that. You see them, people use them for a couple months and they take them off. And I know so many players that have done that. But they're going for a brighter sound or a more resonant sound. Why? I've never experimented myself with that. Why do people slap those on their bass?
Bass players, more than any other instrumentalist, they're more likely to work on their own instruments. They're more likely to tinker, and they're more likely to try all sorts of crazy schemes. I'm fond of telling my clients they better be able to explain to you in language you can understand what this is going to do to your sound or your playability or whatever.
Yeah. Because
there's so much sort of snake oil, if you will.
Right.
There's so many things that get out there that I look at and go, no, that's it. No. It's great that there's this class. I mean, Chuck's whole thing is maybe even to a fault sometimes, optimum sound, doing everything you get the best sound. Well, most bass players are that way, but they're not all. Some guys just want that bass, the doghouse they can take to the gig and, as I say, pay their mortgage or whatever,
Yeah.
feed their families,
Okay. Interesting. I'm always curious because, that's totally, I remember talking with a bass player friend of mine in Chicago, and he's always trying something different. And he was talking with a violinist who was just looking at him like he was crazy. But I think it's just a different culture.
Well, bass players will work on their own instruments. No violinist would touch their instrument.
Right.
Forget it. But bass players all the time. I kind of think that has to do with bass players are the mechanics of the band.
Yeah.
When a band has got a great bass player, very often nobody realizes it. They think the band kicked butt. If it's the sax player, everybody knows it. Vocalist, whatever, piano player, bass player. They're the unsung heroes. I'm fond of saying bass players try and make it sound in pop bands like the drummer and the guitar player listen to one another. They don't. They're both too loud, right?
Right.
But, the bass functions as the glue to pull the whole thing. Bass players produce from their chair. Yeah. So they're self-effacing and they're mechanics. They're playing a line. How many times, because I was a very active bass player for a lot of my life. Mm-hmm. I really moved to New York to be a bass player. The luthier was the way to pay my at that point, rent,
Yeah.
Bass player, so the bass line that I'm would write, the best bass line is one that takes the elements, if you've got a guitar player and a drummer whose sense of time is fighting a little bit, there's somewhere where the bass can sit to kind of pull that all together.
Yeah.
In a perfect world, you're all on the same beat, but as I said, perfection's this ideal nobody reaches, huh?
Right.
We've all played with bad drummers and musicians who don't listen to one another. And I was fond as a player. I loved gigs with no rehearsal because everybody listened to one another. The music was always better.
Yep.
And I love bands where we just rehearsed enough to learn the new tunes, because I've been in bands where you over-rehearse and everybody just starts playing their part without listening to anybody else and without thinking about how it was all working.
Yeah.
But bass players, they're always producing. A disproportionate number of bass players become engineers and producers.
Yeah,
because that's what they're in it for,
Yeah. Huh.
Again, the violinists don't do that.
Right.
Guitar players maybe a little. Drummers, not so much. But then there's some question as to whether they're musicians even. So
yeah.
It depends on the drummer. Let me weigh in on that one. Some are, some aren't. I guess that's true of all musicians.
Yeah, no, but that's true about bass players. That's interesting. I've always wondered why that is. I mean, I can understand if you talk about it in the orchestra, like violinists are so busy like playing their melodies and their 10 million notes. We have more time to sit back there and kind of think and observe.
While you're counting refs.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Because I've noticed bass players, they become conductors more. They just seem to be a lot more into side projects. Yeah, they totally tinker on their instrument more. You were talking about the endpin. So you found that if your endpin has too much mass, that can interfere with the sound too.
There's a particular manufacturer, and I won't name his name. Yeah. Somebody who's a friend of mine who I love and respect. And a competitor of mine, but they're not. But he has his shop has an endpin that's, I've actually got the weight right here, 617 grams
Okay.
And we did an experiment where we took that end pin from bass to bass, and every bass it went on, it lost some sound.
Okay.
Noticeably to me and to the client. My favorite end pin happens to be 367 grams.
Okay.
And my second favorite, and the more common one, is 499 grams.
Okay.
So 500 grams in an end pin might be the outer edge of what's good. When you get to 600 grams, it's too much weight. I can wrap my brain around the physics of a lot of things on the bass. I can't figure out why that's the fact.
Yeah.
I know weight up on the top is going to kill it. I know weight on the top of the instrument itself is going to kill it. How many times do people go to me, oh, the buzz goes away when I put my hands here, so the buzz must be here. And I look at them like, no, you're just taking energy away from the top. You're not moving the top enough. It's not, but it happens all the time. Adjusters. Everybody talks about wood adjusters versus metal adjusters.
Yeah.
Here's my take on that. You didn't ask, but I figure we're talking about the physics.
Yeah.
Again, mass is a friend, but, for the primary function of a double bass bridge, but to take the movement of the strings and transmit it to the top, you could make that out of steel, out of concrete, out of stone, out of anything stiff enough. But there's a secondary consideration, and the bridge would function as it should. You get the sound of the bass. But think about it. When you pluck or bow the string is now lengthening and shortening minutely, but it's trying to move longer and shorter. So your bridge acts like a filter.
Okay.
The more flexible it is, the more bottom end, the more open sounding, and the stiffer it is, the more it filters out the largest sound wave, the fundamental, and encourages mid-range. And so ebony adjusters, which everybody thinks, oh my God, they're natural, they're going to conduct the sound. And they're thinking about sound waves through the air. And it's a kind of a complicated concept. I'm always amazed that so many people think this way. I mean, they're dead wrong. But I myself, when I was a younger man, thought that that's how it worked. But no, they're actually a little stiffer than the maple they replace. And as such, they tend to make it a little more mid-rangey.
Okay.
I've come around to the best adjusters are single-piece aluminum. The two-piece aluminum functions fine, but they always come apart. With a 1/4-20 thread.
Okay.
The bigger ones, the 5/16, which a lot of the shops are using now, are brighter. They're a little stiffer than the maple.
Okay.
And you can use that to your advantage if you want. But I had a Wolfie bass, again, up to normal in the New York Philharmonic, that all we did one winter is swap from a bridge with the 5/16, the bigger adjusters, to the 1/4-20. And the player and I both noticed a significant increase in the bottom end.
Oh, okay.
But it's that secondary function of it. It's flexible. If the stiffer it is, the less it lets the string move.
Okay. Interesting. So it's like mass everywhere. Like if we're talking about the tailpiece, we're talking about the end pin, talking about the bridge adjusters up top. That mass is not your friend.
The bridge adjusters, it's not the mass as much as the stiffness.
The stiffness.
I would posit.
Okay.
And it happens that the more massive they are, generally the stiffer it would be. Makes sense.
Right.
So in that regard, but in that case, it's not exactly the mass as much as it is the flexibility.
Okay.
In my opinion,
Okay.
And from my observation, I should say too.
And mass up top, are you thinking neck block, or are you thinking even above that, like the neck itself? Or
I can see extension with the metal, the typewriter keys, as Chuck always calls it, which have fallen way out of favor anyway.
Right.
The Stenholm, for a while, Holsteins used to import a British-made one that the keys all were the right direction. On the Stenholm, they're the reverse.
Right.
Your C sharp is closest to the bridge, and they go down the opposite. But those have all fallen out of favor in my lifetime, in my 40 years. And fingered extensions and capos like Rob's have become the norm. And that's partially because, by my lights, less mass. A properly installed fingered C extension actually helps the sound of the bass because it stiffens the scroll a little bit, given that the strings are stuck up there. But if you start adding mass to that, it starts to hurt it. In the electric bass world, there was this horrible thing called the fathead about 30 years ago. And it was a brass plate. You took the tuning gears off and you put a brass plate up on the top. Just a killer. You didn't do anything. But again, bass players, they keep trying crazy stuff.
Right.
Editing myself in case it's not just you and I here. So.
Okay. I remember the fathead. I remember that thing on the electric. Okay. Interesting. But it's just adding mass. That just like kind of like the.
It's adding mass, and in this case, to no good purpose. You know, really, we'd like your bridge, if it could be completely massless, would be great because it wouldn't interfere at all. So many setup things are the meeting of two opposing things. You want your bridge stiff enough that it can't warp easily, but you want it thin enough and flexible enough that it doesn't interfere with the string, that it allows the string to do. And I always think there's a bunch of spots where two graphs meet, and where somewhere at 80% or something they cross, and that's what you're really shooting for, you know.
Okay.
So many setup considerations.
Yeah. Yeah, man, this is fascinating. Yeah, we get to free up your repair time so you can devote more of it to the science of this stuff, because this is totally. I'm learning so much. You got my brain going here.
You know, I get a lot of clients who tell me, you know, how fascinating they find. It's not out there. You know, I've got a book in me. So I've got a couple books in me, and I've got to get the time for them. But one on the stuff that I've discovered and learned from working on these instruments all the time is certainly in the works, or something I've got to get the time for. You know?
I'd love to. Now, I've been familiar with your vertical bass. I've seen pictures of that, and I'm familiar with that bass. I think ever since I was a teenager.
Sold over 300 of the first non-collapsible, non-foldable, and I've only sold about 40 of the foldables. Ratso Harris, I have to shout out to Ratso Harris. He's the one that got me to make the new MDB2. After September 11th, when it became impossible to take basses anywhere, all of a sudden, my electric upright in its big case, nobody wanted them on the planes.
Yeah.
And Ratso wanted a removable neck, but I went and just sort of thought about it for a while, and I got the idea for the folding. Ends up somebody already had that idea for a guitar, but you don't see it because guitars are small enough already.
Right.
But we actually found by the time I re-engineered the instrument to fold, it actually sounds better. Ratso's got one of each, and he just loves the folding one. One day he called me to tell me how great it sounded on a recording session, and then a buddy of mine who knew the guitar player called me to say how the person whose session it was had called him to say how great the bass sounded. So I know they weren't just blowing smoke at Ratso. You know? The same day, too. It was amazing. They must have really liked it. You know?
I wonder what made it. Did the folding mechanism somehow make it sound better, or was it just re-engineering?
No, you know what it really is that I re-engineered the bars differently.
Okay.
So, years I never set out to design an electric upright.
Yeah.
But people would bring me, it was the Z bass more than any other, would bring me these basses and say, Bill, can you get this to sound better? They weren't happy with them.
Yeah.
And I eventually realized that I could do some stuff, but they all had a fundamental problem. To get enough bottom end, they lessened the tailpiece over the top of the bridge. And that gives you more bass, but it also slows your attack. So instead of a nice strong you get more of a blah. Which sometimes you might want, but a lot of times you don't. And I realized that they were forced to do that because the bridge was stiff. The top of a double bass. Take the E string on your bass and pull it towards you and lower it, and watch how the top moves. I do this all the time with my clients, and then I go, that's bottom end, people, right there. That's low frequency, that amount of flexibility. So I realized that if you really wanted to get the string sound right, people always talk about electric instruments and go, oh, the electronics can fix it. No, that's wrong. That's completely wrong. Yeah. The string sound has to be right, and then you can amplify it, but amplification is extremely limited. So think of all the pickups. I was a big Underwood pickup guy for the longest time because it was the only pickup that got the attack characteristic correct.
Yeah.
And attack is a tonal change across time. You can't EQ that in. You can't. I mean, I suppose you could, but it would be a very complicated device that would have to know when to change the, you'd have to pair it with a compressor, with something that played with the attack. But suffice it to say, it's just better to get the string sound right in the first place.
Right.
So I thought on it, and realized that the thing that I got the patent on, the spruce spring bars. I started isolating my bridge on a pair of bars to replicate that flexibility.
Okay.
And I tried at first with just an E string bar, and I discovered that the bridge is very sided. The low string side sounded good. The top sounded just like all the other ones, like thunk.
Okay.
So I needed flexibility on both sides, but that's why my vertical bass bars are longer on the E string side, because your top has got more flexibility. This is some of the thinking that I'm utilizing in my acoustic bass guitar design too.
Yeah. Okay.
It was these things that got me there. And then the soundpost side is flexible, but not as flexible. Well, it's reproducing a smaller sound wave. It makes sense. So when I go to so those bars are free floating on the original vertical basses. You take them off, the bars just come off, because if you glued them on, they're not as flexible. So when I started working with the folding bass and I used my regular size bars, I was gluing one end on, because now you're taking it apart, and I didn't want the bars to go flying.
Yeah, okay.
Well, I found I had to lengthen the bars significantly. In fact, I finally came to a design that allowed me the most amount of length that I possibly could, and I think that's why the new instrument sounds better.
Okay.
They're still brighter and a little cleaner sounding than a real upright. Years ago, when Eddie Gomez was doing a session at Jay Beckenstein's studio at Spyro Gyra, and I heard through the grapevine that through Eddie, that they loved the sound of my electric upright, that it was so easy to record.
Nice.
I'm proud of that. And I got a patent on first application. It was a novel enough idea. And I'm surprised now that my patent's in the public domain. You only get, not that it made me any money really, that it's not replicated more, because it really does make a huge difference on any of these instruments. I've made cellos and a violin or two as well on the same principles, and it works just as well. You just have to scale it properly for the size of the instrument.
Now, when did you start to think about making because you got the Traveler bass now, right?
Well, I don't anymore.
Okay.
The Traveler bass. So all of a sudden, September 11th comes in, and now people are bringing me in and asking me to make their necks movable.
Yeah.
Because they can't. And originally somebody brought me a design from the West Coast that they wanted me to replicate, where you put a bolt into the block and it sticks straight up, and then you put the neck on that. And you had to take out a lot of material. It was tough to do without taking the top off. The first time I did it was on a bass that I had the top off.
Okay.
And it just was clunky. You couldn't do it on sliding dovetails like K's.
Uh-huh.
So I did it that way for a couple people, but then it was really kind of trending. I redesigned it completely to the way that the Traveler bass had, but I still had problems getting the cases light enough.
Okay.
So I actually went and figured if I diminished the size of the body, I could have a smaller case to get my weight where I wanted it to be. And I knew from like the Voight and Geiger's and from Carleen Hutchins' research that the depth of the ribs doesn't affect the sound of the bass at all. Everybody thinks it does. It's the size of your top.
Oh, okay.
So,
interesting.
Again, that's all the sounds in the top. The bass doesn't care about how big that air cavity is. I've got a beautiful American bass for sale in my New York City shop right now with ribs that are maybe 4 inches deep, and it sounds killing.
Wow.
Carleen Hutchins' new violin family basses all have narrow ribs. The only thing that might make a difference in violin theory is what they call AO-BO tuning. AO being the air cavity's note that you could blow across your F-hole like a bottle, that note, and BO would be mute the strings, tap the instrument, and there's one prevalent note, probably related to that top note. And if you match those, violinists have found that you can really, it opens up the sound a little bit. We're not talking, but we're talking noticeable, but not like, oh my God,
Yeah, right.
The next strad.
Right.
What Carleen found with her experiments is that on a bass, no matter how big that cavity was, you're only getting 10 or 15 hertz difference. So you could never achieve that tuning. That's what got Chuck talking about his mode matching, where he starts playing games with the tailpiece. Most of I haven't found that to be. It's an interesting thing, but there's too many. It affects too many other things. It doesn't quite work for me. But Chuck was trying to somehow get AO-BO tuning lined up with on the bass, where you can't. It's really hard to get the note on the bass. Mm-hmm. Chuck figured out a way to do it, but it's really, really difficult. You can't just blow across the F-holes like you can on smaller instruments.
Right.
But a fascinating bit of history of science that people have been working on, And in an instance, once again, where the violin and the bass are different. You can vary that cavity enough on a violin, but you can't on a bass.
Okay. Wow. Conventional wisdom, or what I always hear is like, oh yeah, the deeper the ribs, the fuller the sound, but it's really the top that's it's
only the top. So and I know so there's a manufacturer that makes a travel instrument where they've taken away part of the top. I won't name names.
Yeah.
And I've worked a lot with those instruments, and I'm up against a sort of a brick wall because you're missing a third of the top, and you just can never get that back.
Okay.
And they've made the ribs deep. I don't think they need to. I've heard the Voight and Geiger basses. My friend Rob has got one. Mm-hmm. Were made by a German and a Californian in Chicago area in the 1930s. And they were narrow rib basses. Their feeling was that the narrow rib would somehow help it cut through string bands. And I don't know where I got that story, but I know it's a true fact, as David Cohn once said. But I'm here to tell you, I've close your eyes. It's a perceived difference. People see a big body and they think they're going to get a big sound. Go hand it to a bunch of blind people. They've done this with violins. They did a test that basically is proven. They did it twice, where they had people play various violins, new and old, and rate them. And there was one strad that must have been a dog. I'd love to work on it. I bet you I could get it to sound better. And there were some modern violins that performed equally as well. And I've known this instinctively. I've been telling people for years, the myth of Stradivarius. Stradivarius was a brilliant man, and not to take anything away from him. I think the idea that there's a secret to Stradivarius just denigrates the fact that he was a brilliant craftsman who came along at just the right time, where they were still experimenting with what a violin was, how big and how small, how much arching. And he played games until he found the optimum. Like that, when I was talking about you take various factors and find the spot where they intersect the closest, some 80%. That's what he did. And that's why when you see Strad copies, they truly are Strad copies. Uh-huh. When he started making violins, everybody said, this guy's got it. And they copied him. Coincidentally, or incidentally, I'm not sure which, further, farther. He was independently wealthy. We know because he married well, and he paid cash for his house in Pomona. You glean these things from historical records. So he could afford to experiment, and he was a success in his own day because he experimented and came up with such a great instrument. But the idea that you can put some varnish on an indifferent fiddle and get a great instrument, no.
Right.
All the guys. It's crazy. Okay. Now, Carlene Hutchins said to me, and I guess at the time, she thinks that he may have used sweetgrass ash in some way. And I never got to really, before she passed, really figure out exactly what she was talking about in that regard. But I do know, too, that there was a story in the Strad 20 years ago about a tale of two cellos that went down in the same shipwreck. One was completely destroyed by the time it was pulled up in the 20th century, but the Strad cello was restorable. We think he may have used a silicate solution on both sides. They know that he used a stiffener of some sort, egg whites, semen, of all things, and you can buy sodium silicate. And I've used sodium silicate successfully on worm-ridden tops to stiffen them up. But he was able to saturate his tops such that he could make them a little thinner than other people. But it's my contention that the tuning was still more important.
Okay.
They're getting that note more than anything else. I've got a great Carlene story, too, because one of the last times I visited her in Montclair before she retired to New Hampshire, I was lucky enough to see her in New Hampshire a couple of times, too. She talked about an experiment she did. She sort of started what we call three-plate tuning. You take the top or back, and you work on just it, and you'd study it. And usually what she do, and what a lot of researchers to this day do, is they go put a coil to the center of the top, they suspend the top, they put a magnet, and then they run a sine wave through that coil, and then they capture it and they graph what the frequency response is.
Okay.
And Carlene took a viola top because she was a violist, and that was really where her love was. She measured a viola top, and then she held it in her hands and just concentrated energy into it. And then she tested it, and it changed. And she said, "Bill, I can't publish this. This flies in the face of everything I've worked for." And I said to her, I don't understand quantum mechanics, but I think there could be something to that. And she never, again, that was an unpublished note. There's a biographical film that the Tactile Acoustical Society is going to have something. Wait, I can't remember her first name. A filmmaker that probably 10 years ago they started. I think they're still working on it. That I tell that story. I don't know if she ever told anybody else, or if I'm the only one that ever heard that story. But what really impressed me is that here's this hard scientist who changed the violin world, and yet she still would do an experiment like that. I think that was really telling. There are other explanations. Did the humidity change in the room she was working in? I can think of but I think she is a smart enough person to some degree, taken all that into account.
Well, it's cool that she was still experimenting. Yeah, finding success, but then still
that's the mark of any genius.
Yeah.
She was a genius. I don't think anybody that's good at something rests on their laurels. Or I say Chuck taught me how to do a bunch of jobs a certain way. I don't think I do hardly any job the way Chuck taught me. Mm-hmm. Not because it was wrong, but because I took the ball and ran with it. I started looking at other methodologies. I'm fond of saying that I don't think that necessity was the mother of invention. In my case, it's laziness. Necessity might have been the midwife. But for instance, fingerboard dressings, Chuck has a method that in all of his books he still espouses. And it's very tree, not forest. Mm-hmm. And somewhere in there, I looked at the forest, and I have a radically different way that I get the same result. I just get it quicker. I'm a lazy man, Jason.
Well, but that's a beautiful. Well, what do you do in terms of fingerboard dressings? Like, what's different than?
I'll tell you. You want to have 30 seconds of a dip across the entire board. You want the curve to be absolutely the same from one end to the other. I use a 2-foot straight edge, and that's what I do most of my work with. And I make sure, and then I use a very, very sharp block plane. The smallest adjustable block plane I can get my hands on. I've only seen 3 in my lifetime. They're the Stanley 102 size with a Bailey adjustment for you tool freaks out there. And I use the sharp plane set just so that, and it kicks up all the bumps. But I'm absolutely convinced that nobody needs more than 3/32 of an inch of drop across their fingerboard. When we first, it was Gary Peacock. Probably in, I'm going to say 1979, 1980, when David Gage was still in the shop too. Gary stood over Chuck and said, "No, make that flatter end to end." Uh-huh. At this point in time, everybody was used to gut strings. They were swooping the Jesus out of boards. They were putting 1/4 of an inch or more of relief from end to end. When you talk about curve, everybody thinks you mean the curve side to side. But so I use the phrase relief instead. And he instinctively knew that was making it harder to play. And by the way, the flatter you make it, the more any little bump is going to show up and buzz. And the string reacts to tonally. If the curve isn't absolutely the same from one end to the other, it'll change. It'll be darker in spots where it's deeper and brighter in spots where it's flatter to width. But he made Chuck do this end-to-end. David and I both, everybody played it, and it was amazing. It growled. It was so easy to play. It had tons of sustain. You weren't stretching out the top end, the mid-range, all the beautiful stuff in the basses and the upper partials. You know, we want boom, but the mid-range, all the character is up there. I remember a month or two later, I'm putting a new fingerboard on Mike Richland's bass. It took me 8 hours to get that flat fingerboard perfectly consistent, which is why I then figured out another method where I can do it in an hour's time. That was laziness kicking in. It took me a great number of years. Yeah. For the longest time, when I went into the business in 77, the posts were too tight and the fingerboards were too deep. People were putting on solo gauge strings tuned down.
Yeah.
Now they're not getting any weight on the top. They're not getting any volume. The attack is going to crap. But that's what they had to do. We had about a good 10-year period where people would say, oh, the Traeger shop, they're the best for fingerboards. I would always say, actually, we're the best for everything, you realize. But we were renowned for the fingerboards. But eventually, that's, where sound posts are still routinely too tight, fingerboard dressings, people figured that out. Partially because guitar luthiers have been doing much flatter curves for eons. It was for whatever reasons, it was a skill that everybody's picked up. But I still see people sometimes dig them out. It doesn't matter what music you're playing, what strings, what bass. 30 seconds of drop across the 34 inches. Any more than that, you're just making it too hard to play and darker. If you get buzz because you play that hard, raise your action. You'll get more attack. You'll get more punch. You'll get more volume. And this is something that took me 30 years to figure out.
Okay.
I used to bury the depth of curves more. And it's hard to get it perfectly consistent when there's only that much relief. But it can be done. It's just a skill set that you got to develop. Yeah. And it makes a world of difference.
Well, thanks again for chatting, Bill. Great to talk to you. Can't wait to catch up with you in person. And check out Bill online at merchantbass.com. And that's going to do it for another episode of Contrabass Conversations. We're coming up to our 10th anniversary. We're coming up to our 300th episode. Lots of exciting things going on here. Send me a message. Give me a suggestion for an interview guest, a topic, thoughts on the show, anything you'd like to share. I love to hear from you. Feedback at contrabassconversations.com. If you're interested in supporting the show, and you can do that in many different ways. Some of them are financial. A lot of them aren't. Learn about what you can do to help keep this thing going at contrabassconversations.com/support. So thanks for tuning in, and we will see you again soon for more life on the low end of the spectrum.